Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Corn Board.
Growing more with less is the mantra of Nebraska's corn farmers, and they're using incredible technology to do it. Soil moisture monitors let them know when their crop needs water and how much. GPS systems eliminate overlaps in the field, saving fuel and money. New hybrids reduce the use of pesticides and increase yields. When you're talking new technology and innovation, Nebraska corn farmers are all ears. Nebraska's family corn farmers, sustaining innovation.
Market Journal, television for agricultural business decisions, is a presentation of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine, and major funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Corn Board.
Welcome to this week's edition of Market Journal. I'm Jeff Wilkerson. On this episode, Jeff Peterson looks at the USDA's latest supply and demand numbers. Frank Mitloehner discusses the impact livestock have on climate change. Dennis Conley analyzes the world crude oil markets. And Rob Eirich describes how to minimize cattle heat stress. Jeff Peterson from Heartland Farm Partners is our market analyst this week. The USDA's May crop report helped corn prices rise and soybean prices soar on Tuesday. Soybeans were aided especially by ending stocks estimates below traders' expectations. Earlier in the week, the agency's latest crop progress report showed U.S. farmers were 14 points ahead of the country's 5-year average corn planting pace and 7 points better than normal in soybeans. Nebraska is still lagging behind. Growers are 6 points behind in corn and 8 points off in soybeans. We talked with Jeff Thursday afternoon and began by asking for his thoughts on how the May crop report impacted markets.
If I was to sum it up in a few words, it'd really be pleasantly surprised in demand, Jeff. It's nice getting the May report out of the way. It's our first look at USDA's thoughts on the 2016 crop, and then keep in mind that crop for corn and beans won't start until August and carries around through September.
Why were traders so surprised, especially with the soybeans?
Yeah, that's the big talk right now. And it really comes down to the ending stocks for the 2016 crop. 305 million bushels. That's a lot less than what they're expecting. 405 million was what they were looking at as an average guess. The last time we saw any numbers out of USDA in regard to the 16 would have been the outlook, and that was 440 million bushels. So we had a 175 million bushel increase on the demand side. If we break that down, that was 145 million more bushels for exports, about 35 million more bushels for the crush, and then residual has dropped down about 10. As we dig deeper into those numbers, it looks like USDA believes about 20 million bushels of those crush is actually going to get exported because of some of the problems that's coming out of South America. On top of that, though, Jeff, for the 2015 crop, 45 million more bushels of demand, 35 million more for exports, 10 million more bushels for crush. As we dug into those crush numbers, all of the meal from that crush is going to be exported. And the reason for that, a lot of that is because of what's going on in South America. In the numbers for 2015, production down 129 million. Now the thing about that, though, is we come back into 2016, they are raising it back up 165 million, but those are some big swings.
Yeah, and you're talking bushels there too.
Exactly, on bushels.
The high that we saw this week, is that the high for the contract?
Well, I think if we're a pure technician, we'd say probably not, but since we are managing price risk and we're looking at it from the fundamental and technical side, I think it is, unless we see additional problems down the road. And what kind of problem that would take is that would take something on the weather side sometime later in the summer.
What was the corn market reaction to these estimates?
You know what, the corn market jumped pretty good too. It was up 11 cents for the day. The number, we moved from the April ending stock number for the 15 crop at 1.862 all the way down to 1.803. But really the whole story was on new crop. And on the new crop side, 2.153 billion was the first shot at the 2016 numbers. That's versus a 2.294 billion that USDA had out there. Now that means there was 535 million more bushels of demand. 300 from feed, 175 from exports, and 50 from the ethanol side. That was some big changes.
Let's shift gears a little bit and talk about planting progress across the U.S. and in Nebraska. What's the update?
You know, it really just depends on where you're at. If you were to take a big picture look and look at it nationally, you'd say, you know what, sitting here at 64% planted versus 50% on average on the corn side nationally, not too bad. But then we take a look at Nebraska, 53% planted versus 59%. And then you dig over to the soybean side, 23% for the national on soybeans versus 16% on the 5-year average. And then you come back in on Nebraska and we see that, you know, we're currently sitting here at about 13% planted versus 21% on the 5-year average. So if you're in Nebraska, if you're in Indiana, Ohio, parts of Kansas, parts of western Iowa, boy, it seems like this thing's dragging out on us.
Yeah, does the delay and does the rally in prices, does it switch acres? Does it reduce total acres?
I think a couple things that happen as we dig back into the numbers. One thing that we think is that we think there'll be some more acres overall out there come in, but I do think that does cause a switch in acres. I do think we could see the bean acre number come up maybe a couple million acres. I wouldn't be surprised to see corn come down maybe 1/2 to 3/4 of a million also because of the profitability and these wet planting conditions that we've had.
What are your sales strategies right now?
You know, right now on the sales strategy side, on the bean side first, you know, we'd like getting sold here and then actually having some upside protection if it'd make you feel more comfortable. On the corn side, we're still being a little bit patient here.
That's for new crop, roll crop.
That would be on the new crop side. On the old crop, I'd be using these price moves we have to clean up the bushels you've got in the bins.
Basis expectations?
You know, as we go forward, Jeff, we'll have to keep a close eye on the basis. We think we could see a little bit of narrowing yet on the old crop basis because it's widened out so much. New crop is still up in the air, but I'd still want to be using hedge to arrives if I was making sales.
Next week, Elaine Cubb will be with us to look at corn and soybean markets, and University of Missouri Extension economist Ron Plain will join us to look at hog markets. In 2006, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations said livestock accounted for 18% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions, more than transportation. But Frank Mitloehner, a professor and extension specialist in air quality at the University of California, Davis, challenged the methodology behind those findings and discovered the FAO didn't apply the same life cycle analysis to transportation that it did to livestock. Further, he found the emissions share from livestock in an efficient country such as the U.S. to be far less. Frank spoke Wednesday at Nebraska Extension's Beef Methane Conference in downtown Lincoln. We talked with him at the event and began by asking about how livestock contribute to climate change.
Livestock produce greenhouse gases such as methane, nitrous oxide and others. And these greenhouse gases, they can trap the heat from the sun. And in the United States, a total of 4.2% of all gases come from livestock.
If you research this topic, you can find different numbers as to how much contribution there is from livestock. Why is there so much discrepancy in the science?
The discrepancy in the science is not so important as the discrepancy in the public opinion. Public opinion is largely formed by what they hear in the media. And there they hear global averages superimposed on the United States, which is totally inappropriate because we have internationally the lowest carbon footprint in livestock production. So if you use a global number for the United States, which is either 14 or 18%, then it makes U.S. livestock look really poorly, when indeed we have seen huge advances in reducing environmental footprint of our livestock sector here.
Can you explain more on that, how the efficiency in the U.S. compares to other countries?
For example, we produce approximately 4 times more milk per cow per year in the United States compared to Mexico. We produce at least 10 times more per cow per year compared to an Indian cow. So a US versus an Indian cow, 10 times difference. Now, why are there such differences? Well, there are several main reasons. The one is a nutritional reason. We have fine-tuned the diet of livestock, whether it's beef or dairy or others, to optimize the nutritional needs. And by doing so, we have not just satisfied their maintenance requirements, and that's really what happens in India, but we have optimized also the production requirements. That's one sector that's really, really important. The second one is the veterinary sector. We have learned to prevent animals from being affected by parasites, let's say. Whereas in a place like India, those animals are full of endoparasites, which consume the nutrients that really should go into the livestock. The third sector is genetic progress. We have really learned to breed very fine breeds that are highly productive. And the fourth one is reproductive efficiencies that we have learned to optimize. And so these four tools together have allowed us to shrink our herds, whether it's beef or dairy, by half, but we produce twice as much as we used to, let's say, 20, 30 years ago.
What's the relationship to that, the output or production, to the carbon footprint that livestock has?
So in general, the more efficient you are per animal, the relatively fewer animals you need to produce a given amount of product per, let's say, country. So, for example, here in the United States, we used to have 27 million dairy cows. Today we have 9. We used to have 140 million beef cattle. Today we have 90 million. And even though we have so much fewer animals today than we had, let's say, in the 1970s, we have produced way more product with those smaller herds. And this precisely is where we need to go internationally, because quite frankly, we don't have the resources projected into the future to feed this growing global need for animal protein.
Yeah, that's the question. How do you feed a growing population by that target year of 2050 and do it in a way that doesn't drastically alter the climate?
Well, look, I'm in my 40s. I'm in my mid-40s. When I was a little boy, we had 3 billion people in the world. Today, we have 7 billion. Once I'm an old man, we'll have 9.5 billion people. So world human population will have tripled throughout my lifetime. And while human population will have tripled, and I find that astonishing, the natural resources to feed those people will not have tripled. We will not have 3 times more water, fertilizer, land, and so on. But if we're lucky, the same amount or less. You know. So the question then arises, how do we feed these people? And the answer to that is, and there's only one answer to that, we have to become more efficient. We have to teach the world what we have learned here ourselves, which is that we have to produce more with less. And that's a difficult lesson to learn. And that's a lesson that our citizens in this country are totally oblivious to. They do not have any idea of how efficiencies in food production are linked to the environmental footprint of our food products.
Is there a way to communicate that message?
I think there is. So, for example, I teach a class in California with 300 undergraduate students. They're very critical of technology use in food production. I show them a 1950 or 1960 Chevy, and I show them a 2015 Chevy, and I ask them, so which one do you like better, the 1960 Chevy or the 2015 Chevy? 95% of the class would prefer driving the 1960 Chevy. Then I show them what the fuel economy was, the safety standards, no safety belts, no airbags. I show them that there were no catalytic converters in those old cars and so on. And then after I show them the differences between the old and the new, I ask the same question again. Which car would you want to drive now? And everybody flip-flops. The same is true for livestock production. People have this romantic view of a 1960 beef operation or dairy operation, the red barns. The red barns are our biggest enemies because they suggest to the consumer that that's the way we should produce livestock, when indeed we are lucky that we are no longer producing livestock that way. From an animal perspective, we have much better welfare today. From an environmental perspective, we have cut our environmental footprint by several-fold. Food safety has become much better. Prices have become much better. We have a lot to brag about, yet we are the nation's best-kept secret.
Recap videos from the Beef Methane Conference will soon be posted online. You can view those at beef.unl.edu. The U.S. Energy Information Administration expects the U.S. to churn out about 8.6 million barrels of crude oil per day this year, a decrease of about 9% from 2015. The EIA said this week it thinks the price of West Texas Intermediate oil will average about $40 a barrel in 2016 and just more than $50 a barrel next year. But the government agency says that expectation comes with a high degree of uncertainty. We spoke in March with University of Nebraska-Lincoln Ag Economics Emeritus Professor Dennis Conley about the outlook for gasoline, and this week we talked with Dennis again to learn why it's so difficult to forecast the path ahead for the world crude oil market.
Jeff, it's complicated because there are many producers in the world of crude oil. You have The three major countries are Saudi Arabia, Russia, and the United States. They're the big producers. And then you have some other producers that are still significant, like Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, and so on and so forth. But there's a lot of them there that are producing.
Why is it important to focus on the ways that these different countries are producing?
It's interesting because we tend to think of market economics driven by private industry, but around 80% of the crude oil produced in the world is by state government enterprises. So Saudi Arabia, Russia, Venezuela, Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, and others, they're all state governments. The United States, on the other hand, the production here is in the private sector. So they're subject to market economics. But when you're a state government enterprise, not so much so, if anything, when their revenues go down for their crude oil production and sales, they want to actually produce more crude oil to be able to finance their public expenditures in their countries. And it's like agricultural producers in Nebraska. Price of corn goes down, we want to produce more so we can sell more to keep our revenue at the level we like.
How has output affected prices? And then we'll talk about the alternative.
We recently looked at gasoline prices at $3.50 a gallon in the past years, and gasoline prices are largely determined by the key ingredient of crude oil that goes into that gasoline. And so when crude oil prices were up around $90 to $100 a barrel, that's when we saw $3.50 a gallon gasoline prices. Now crude oil prices are around $40 to $45 a barrel, and that's why we're seeing $2.25 a gallon gasoline prices.
What's the outlook over both the short term and the long term for crude oil?
The short term is that the expectation is that the price of crude oil for the rest of this year will probably stay in this $40 to $50 a barrel range because of what Saudi Arabia is doing. They're going to increase their supply of crude oil, add 1 million barrels per day. Iran is trying to do the same thing, add another 2 million barrels per day, and other producers, state government enterprises. The question is, how much does that get offset by cuts of production in the United States that's subject to market conditions? But the outlook is $40 to $50 a barrel, which means gasoline prices probably in the $2.25, $2.50 range for the rest of this year. So that's the short range.
And the long-term outlook?
The long term is complicated. And it's complicated because of public sector or government entities that produce crude oil versus private sector entities. The International Energy Agency, which is responsible for keeping track of world energy, world crude oil supplies, et cetera, have produced a world report that says out to 2020, they expect these supplies to tighten up. They expect the growth in supplies to diminish, if you will, to decline. Ending stocks and carryovers will subsequently decline, and that will bring then these prices of crude oil back up into the $60, $70, $80 range, and with that would be gasoline prices up around $3. Now, I'm an old elephant that has some memory. You guys are young tigers. You and Curtis are young tigers. I go back to 1985 when the oil minister for Saudi Arabia said, we're no longer going to hold up the crude oil prices for OPEC. We're going to dump our crude oil into the world market. What happened within 6 months is the price of crude oil went to 1/3 of the price it had been at that time. What I hear now from Saudi Arabia as well, from the oil ministers, is that they're going to continue to add crude oil to the world supply. So as Mark Twain says, well, history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. So I listen to these comments, and in my own personal opinion is that in the next 4 to 5 years, by 2020, we're still going to see very ample crude oil supplies, and my expectation would be $40 to $50 a barrel. Gasoline prices probably in this $2.25 to $2.75 a range. That's good for the U.S. economy, and that's good for Nebraska agriculture.
You can see our previous conversation about the outlook for gasoline prices in the March 18th episode of Market Journal. The Maine Nebraska farmer says agriculture programs began at Northeast Community College in 1973, but in recent years, those programs have been on the fast track. The college in Norfolk recently released its 5-year strategic proposal This month's issue says the $40 million plan calls for expanding programs and constructing multiple facilities, many built around the college's current 45,000 square foot ag complex. You can read more about the growth goals at Northeast Community College in the May Nebraska Farmer. With the warmth and humidity of summer ahead, this week we talked about heat stress with Rob Eirich, Nebraska's Director of Beef Quality Assurance. University of Nebraska-Lincoln literature on the subject indicates how hard it is for cattle to enter warmer months. It takes animals 30 days to adapt to average temperatures changing from 50 degrees to 80 degrees. Their water needs increase too. When the thermometer is above 80, cattle need at least 20 gallons per day for every 1,000 pounds. We talked with Rob Wednesday in the R.B. Warren Arena on campus and began by asking about how heat stress can impact cattle.
When you start looking at high humidity, high heat times of the year as we're moving into our summer months, you really see a loss in feed efficiencies. You see possible health concerns, but you also see some mortality in these type of situations. If you get cattle way up into that high heat area where we see that dangerous impact, we see a lot of numbers impacting cattle here, especially in central to eastern Nebraska. It's a very big concern through the summer months.
What can producers do to help limit the effects of heat stress?
Well, I think one, they need to be prepared. Look at the forecast and kind of look at how that forecast is going to play out, and look at some of our tools that we have out there, our temperature humidity index, and kind of see, okay, if we're moving into this temperature and this humidity as a forecast, where are we? Is there an alert? Are we in a serious danger or an emergency scenario? And that way we can prepare ourselves ahead of time, giving additional water, shading, sprinklers, and those type of things.
How efficient or how important can water shading be in a feedlot?
Oh, it can be actually probably a big saver for them when we start talking about the morbidity scenario. And if we kind of if we can have additional water supply, open water supply, where those cattle have access to it easier and more often, that's going to be a key. If we can actually keep those cattle cooled down from the early temperature all the way through the peak of the day, and that might encounter some open air where they can get that airflow through, but also keeping those mounds sprinkled and keep them cool, because that moisture coming up, they can actually keep some cooling, keep that animal cooled down. But then we also look at other things. If you're looking at maybe improving or doing some improvements on the operation, shading has become a bigger effect. If we can again keep that body temperature cool as long as we can before they hit that peak of the day, that's going to help them as far as internally as well as their external temperatures.
Whether in the feedlot or in the pasture, how should you change the way you handle cattle during those hot days?
Well, definitely. We talk a lot about this through our BQA program. We want to make sure low stress handling, but we also, in the heat of the time, as we kind of look as we go in the summer months, we say we want to see you working those cattle prior to 8 o'clock in the morning, where that temperature is cool, the animals are cool, we don't have increased body temperatures at that time, and so it's a little bit easier on those cattle. But move them in a short distance, making sure that we only keep them in that processing facility for 30 minutes or less. That way we don't have a lot of heat buildup. And if we can do that, that's probably the key part of that processing and movement.
You mentioned heat index. Tell me about the new heat temperature and humidity chart that you have and how people might find it useful.
Well, when you start looking at that chart, again, it's a tool to use to say, okay, they're forecasting 95 degrees at 30% humidity for the next week. How can we prepare ourselves now to make sure we have that supply, water supply, or making sure that we have those cattle where they need to be before we hit that time? That way we don't put any additional stress and movement. Maybe even look at, feeding times and those type of things to manage when those cattle might be able to relax and not increase that body core.
Rob says it's important to remember that working with cattle even at night can be dangerous because the animal's core temperature takes 4 to 6 hours to return to normal. Al Dutcher is off this week in place of his weekly weather forecast. We talked Thursday morning with Martha Shulski, Nebraska's state climatologist and the director of the Nebraska State Climate Office. Martha, going back to last month, can you recap April weather?
Sure. For April, the big story of the month was the precipitation, the rainfall that we had, as well as snowfall in western Nebraska. And we were third wettest on record for the state, behind 1984 and 1920. And we were a little bit warmer than normal for temperatures.
Can you describe some of the severe weather we've seen across the state?
Yeah, it's been pretty interesting the last few days. So May 8th, we had an outbreak in central Nebraska. We had confirmed tornadoes and hail reports as well. And in eastern Nebraska on May 9th, and here in Lincoln even, we had tornadic activity, as well as a lot of damage from hail. That was probably the bigger factor in terms of damage as opposed to the tornadoes. And I did see my first tornado ever, so that was very interesting.
How have those heavy rains affected stream flows?
Yes, stream flows are running above normal or near flood stage or at flood stage, both in the western parts of the state along the Platte and North Platte and South Platte, and in eastern Nebraska along the Missouri in particular, where it's at or above flood stage.
So is this a level of concern, and what does it mean when more snowpack enters those rivers?
Right. So Lake McConaughey is about 89% of maximum capacity at the moment. They are doing some releases now due to snowmelt that's already started in the Rockies and rains that they've received in Wyoming. So we can expect kind of a bump in flow along the Platte. And snowmelt in the Rockies was above normal for this year, impacting us. And so we can start to see when the big snowmelt happens that we can see those rivers impacted.
Perhaps an obvious question, but what's the update on drought and soil conditions?
Yes, so as you would expect, there is no abnormal dryness or drought conditions in Nebraska currently.
What's the outlook for next week?
So for next week, maybe something that people don't want to hear in terms of getting into the field, continued wet, it looks like an active weather pattern, and probably cooler than normal temperatures.
What's the update on the transition from El Nino to La Nina?
Right, so we're kind of descending fairly rapidly out of a pretty strong El Nino event, probably going into neutral conditions and then transitioning to a La Nina event by mid to late summer. And if we look at temperature and precipitation conditions, so an increased chance for warmer than normal temperatures beginning in late summer and continuing actually through the fall. And for precipitation, an increased chance for dryness in mid to late summer.
Today's interviews can be found individually on the Market Journal website and through the Market Journal mobile app. They include information on the USDA's May crop report, climate change issues in the beef industry, the crude oil market, and heat stress in cattle. As always, you can keep up with Market Journal during the week by following us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Next week, Elaine Cubb will analyze corn and soybean markets, and Ron Plain will look at hog markets. Until then, thanks for watching. I'm Jeff Wilkerson. We'll see you next week.
Join Market Journal online at marketjournal.unl.edu. You can also follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine, and major funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Corn Board. Market Journal is produced by the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources.